The January wind howled through downtown Chicago with a ferocity that seemed almost personal, cutting through layers of clothing and settling deep into bones. Margaret Ann Holloway stood at the corner of State and Madison, her worn canvas coat doing little to protect her from the bitter cold that swept off Lake Michigan. At 68 years old, she had never imagined her life would lead her here, clutching a plastic grocery bag containing everything she owned in the world, watching the evening commuters rush past her as if she were invisible. The streetlights flickered on as darkness descended over the city, casting long shadows across the icy sidewalks. Margaret's hands trembled, not just from the cold, but from exhaustion. She had spent the past 3 nights sleeping in the heated lobby of Northwestern Memorial Hospital, pretending to wait for a patient until security inevitably asked her to leave around 2 in the morning. Her body ached from the hard chairs, and her mind felt clouded with a fatigue that went beyond physical tiredness. She looked down at her reflection in a darkened store window and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her grey hair, once carefully styled every Saturday morning at Betty's beauty salon, now hung in matted strands around her weathered face. Her blue eyes, which her late husband Thomas had always said reminded him of the summer sky, were now ringed with dark circles and held a hollow emptiness that frightened her when she allowed herself to truly look. Margaret pulled the collar of her coat tighter and began walking south, her thin-soled shoes slipping occasionally on patches of black ice. She had a destination in mind tonight, an abandoned commercial building on West Van Buren Street that she had noticed 3 days earlier. The ground floor windows were boarded up, but she had spotted a side door that appeared to be unlocked. Its frame warped from years of weather and neglect. The temperature was supposed to drop to 5 degrees tonight, with wind chills reaching -15. Margaret knew from her years working as a registered nurse that hypothermia could kill someone her age in a matter of hours. She had no choice but to find real shelter, even if it meant breaking the law. As she walked, memories of her former life played through her mind like scenes from someone else's story. She remembered the modest but comfortable 3-bedroom house in Oak Park, where she and Thomas had raised their daughter, Emily. She could almost smell the pot roast cooking in the oven on Sunday afternoons, hear Thomas's laughter echoing from the living room as he watched the Bears game. Feel Emily's small hand in hers as they walked to the park on summer evenings. That life had ended 3 years ago when Thomas received his pancreatic cancer diagnosis. The disease had moved through him with terrifying speed, and within 8 months, he was gone. Margaret had spent those months caring for him at home, just as she had cared for thousands of patients during her 43-year career at Mercy Hospital. She had bathed him, managed his medications, held his hand through the worst of the pain, and whispered words of love as he took his final breath. What she hadn't anticipated was the financial devastation that would follow. Despite having insurance, the medical bills had accumulated like a slow-moving avalanche. Experimental treatments that insurance wouldn't cover, home health equipment, medications that cost hundreds of dollars per dose. She had depleted their savings, then taken out a second mortgage on the house. When Thomas died, she discovered that his life insurance policy had lapsed 6 months earlier. He had been too sick to manage the paperwork, and she had been too focused on keeping him alive to notice. Within 18 months of his death, she lost the house. Their daughter Emily had moved to Seattle 15 years earlier for a job opportunity and had started a family of her own. Margaret had visited twice, meeting her 2 grandsons who called her Grandma Maggie and showed her their favorite parks and playgrounds. But Emily's marriage had ended badly, and she was struggling as a single mother working 2 jobs to support her children. Margaret couldn't bring herself to burden her daughter with her problems, so she had told Emily she was downsizing to a small apartment and doing fine. The lie had grown larger with each passing month. Margaret had indeed moved to a small efficiency apartment on the south side, taking a part-time job at a laundromat to cover the rent. But the arthritis in her hands had worsened, making it difficult to perform even simple tasks. Her employer, a gruff man named Victor Chen, had been patient at first, but eventually let her go when she could no longer keep up with the physical demands of the work. Without income, she couldn't pay rent. Her landlord, a corporate property management company with no face and less mercy, had evicted her 37 days ago. Since then, she had been surviving on the streets, eating at soup kitchens, sleeping wherever she could find temporary shelter, and slowly losing pieces of herself to the grinding reality of homelessness. Margaret reached the abandoned building just after 7 o'clock. The street was poorly lit, and most of the surrounding structures appeared to be either vacant or housing businesses that closed at 5. She glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then approached the side door she had noticed earlier. The door was painted a faded industrial grey, its surface scarred with rust and graffiti. Margaret tried the handle, and to her relief, it turned. The door creaked open, revealing a dark corridor that smelled of mold and stale air. She hesitated for just a moment, thinking about her younger self, the responsible nurse who always followed the rules, who had never even received a parking ticket. Then the wind gusted behind her, so cold it took her breath away, and she stepped inside. The building's interior was pitch black, and Margaret stood still for several moments, letting her eyes adjust. She could hear water dripping somewhere in the distance and the scurrying of what she hoped were mice rather than rats. Slowly, shapes began to emerge from the darkness, a hallway stretching ahead, doors on either side, a staircase leading up. She moved carefully down the hallway, testing each step before putting her full weight down, afraid the floor might have rotted through in places. The third door on the left was partially open, and she pushed it wider, finding what appeared to be an old office. Moonlight filtered through cracks in the boarded window, providing just enough illumination to see a space about 12 feet square, empty except for some broken office furniture pushed against one wall. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. Margaret set down her plastic bag and lowered herself carefully to the floor, her joints protesting. She had a thin emergency blanket in her bag that someone at a shelter had given her, and she wrapped it around her shoulders. The metallic material crinkled loudly in the silence, but it would help retain body heat. She pulled out a granola bar, one of 2 she had left, and ate it slowly, making it last. Then she lay down on the dusty floor, using her bag as a pillow, and pulled the blanket tighter around herself. Through the cracks in the window, she could see the night sky, starless and heavy with the promise of snow. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to remember warmth. She thought about Thomas, about the way he used to warm his hands on the radiator on cold mornings and then playfully press them against her face to make her squeal. She thought about Emily as a little girl, snuggled between them in bed during thunderstorms. She thought about the hundreds of patients she had cared for over the years, remembering their faces, their stories, the gratitude in their eyes when pain subsided or fear eased. She had been someone once. She had mattered. She had made a difference in the world. Now she was just an old woman hiding in an abandoned building, hoping to survive the night. Margaret drifted into an uneasy sleep, unaware that her attempt to escape the cold would set in motion a series of events that would change not just her own life, but challenge the very foundations of justice in the city she had called home for nearly 7 decades. Margaret woke to the harsh beam of a flashlight in her face and the sound of a man's voice echoing in the empty room. "Don't move, Chicago Police Department." She sat up slowly, disoriented and stiff from sleeping on the concrete floor. Her heart pounded in her chest as her eyes adjusted to the light. 2 police officers stood in the doorway, a young woman with dark hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, and an older man with a thick mustache and a weathered face that suggested he had seen everything the city had to offer. "Please," Margaret said. her voice hoarse from sleep and dehydration. "I'm sorry, I was just trying to stay warm." The male officer, whose name tag read Rodriguez, lowered his flashlight slightly. His partner, Officer Jessica Lynn Patterson, kept her hand near her service weapon, her expression professionally neutral. "You're trespassing on private property," Rodriguez said, though his tone was more weary than aggressive. "We need to see some identification." Margaret's hands shook as she reached into her plastic bag and pulled out her wallet. It was a burgundy leather wallet that Emily had given her 10 years ago for Christmas, now cracked and faded. She extracted her Illinois driver's license and handed it to Rodriguez with trembling fingers. Rodriguez examined the license in the beam of his flashlight. Margaret Ann Holloway, Oak Park. He looked at her more carefully now, taking in her worn clothing, the grey pallor of her skin, the emergency blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. "You're a long way from home, Mrs. Holloway." "I don't have a home anymore," Margaret said simply. Officer Patterson's expression softened almost imperceptibly. She exchanged a glance with her partner, and some unspoken communication passed between them. "The building owner called this in," Rodriguez explained. "They're planning to start renovation next month, and they've been having problems with squatters. We have to take you in." Margaret nodded, too exhausted to argue or plead. She had known this might happen. In some part of her mind, perhaps she had even expected it. She gathered her few belongings back into the plastic bag while the officers waited. As they escorted her out of the building, Margaret noticed that the sun was just beginning to rise, painting the Chicago skyline in shades of pink and gold. It would have been beautiful if she had any capacity left to appreciate beauty. Instead, she felt only a deep, bone-weary resignation. The police car was warm, and as Rodriguez drove toward the station, Margaret found herself fighting the urge to simply close her eyes and pretend none of this was happening. Patterson sat in the passenger seat, and at one point she turned around to look at Margaret. "Do you have any family we can call?" she asked. Margaret thought about Emily in Seattle, probably just waking up to get her boys ready for school. She imagined the phone ringing, a police officer explaining that Emily's mother had been arrested for trespassing. She pictured the worry, the guilt, the frantic scramble to figure out how to help across 2,000 miles of distance. "No," Margaret said. "There's no one." At the station, the processing was efficient and impersonal. Margaret was fingerprinted, photographed, and asked a series of questions by a clerk who looked barely old enough to be out of high school. Her belongings were inventoried and placed in a clear plastic bag, one worn wallet containing $14.37, a tarnished wedding ring she had been too afraid to wear on the streets, a photograph of Thomas and Emily at Emily's college graduation, 2 granola bars, a travel-sized toothbrush, a small bottle of generic ibuprofen, and the emergency blanket. "You'll appear before Judge Whitmore this afternoon," the clerk said, not looking up from her computer screen. First-time offense for trespassing usually results in a fine and time served. Margaret was placed in a holding cell with 3 other women. One was young, probably in her 20s, with tattoos covering her arms and a defiant expression. Another was middle-aged, well-dressed in business attire, sitting perfectly straight with her hands folded in her lap and a look of profound humiliation on her face. The third woman was closer to Margaret's age, wearing a heavy coat and multiple layers despite the warmth of the cell. She smiled at Margaret, revealing several missing teeth. "First time?" the older woman asked. Margaret nodded. "I'm Dorothy Ann Schultz. They call me Dot." She patted the bench beside her. "You look like you could use a friend." Margaret sat down gratefully. Dot smelled of cigarette smoke and unwashed clothing, but her eyes were kind. "Judge Whitmore, they said," Dot asked. When Margaret nodded again, Dot made a face. "Well, that's unfortunate. He's not known for his compassion, especially with folks like us." "Folks like us?" "Poor folks," Homeless folks, people who remind him that the American dream doesn't work out for everyone. Dot leaned back against the wall. I've been before him twice, both times for sleeping in places I wasn't supposed to sleep. The man acts like being poor is a personal failing, like we all just need to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. She laughed bitterly. Hard to pull yourself up by your bootstraps when you don't have any boots. The morning crawled by slowly. A guard brought lunch around noon, a sandwich with processed meat, an apple, and a small carton of milk. Margaret ate mechanically, tasting nothing. The businesswoman in the cell was called out first, then the young woman with tattoos. Dot was called around 2 o'clock, giving Margaret's hand a quick squeeze before she left. "Keep your chin up," she said, "and don't let him make you feel like you're nothing. You're somebody. Don't forget that." Margaret was finally called at 3:15. She was led through a maze of corridors to the courthouse, which connected to the police station through an underground tunnel. The building was old, with high ceilings and marble floors that echoed with every footstep. She was placed in another holding area with several other defendants, all waiting their turn before the judge. At 4:30, a bailiff called her name. Margaret stood, her legs unsteady beneath her, and walked through heavy wooden doors into the courtroom. The room was smaller than she had expected from what she had seen on television, but no less intimidating. Dark wood paneling covered the walls, and rows of benches faced the judge's elevated platform. A few people sat scattered in the gallery. Other defendants waiting their turn, a couple of attorneys reviewing files, and a handful of observers. One of those observers was Victoria Catherine Ashford, though Margaret didn't recognize her. Victoria sat in the third row, wearing an elegant charcoal grey suit and watching the proceedings with an expression of focused attention. She had come to the courthouse that day for an entirely different reason, to observe a hearing related to one of her company's development projects. But that hearing had been postponed. Rather than leave, she had decided to stay and watch the criminal docket, curious about the everyday workings of the justice system. The bailiff directed Margaret to stand before the bench. Judge Richard Whitmore sat elevated above her, a man in his late 50s with steel grey hair and sharp features that seemed permanently fixed in an expression of disapproval. He was reviewing a file on his desk and didn't look up immediately. Margaret Ann Holloway, the prosecutor, a young man named Daniel Jeffrey Morrison, began, charged with criminal trespass to property under Illinois Statute 720 ILCS 5-21-3. The defendant was found on the morning of January 14th in an abandoned commercial building at 447 West Van Buren Street. The property owner, Vanguard Development Corporation, has pressed charges. Judge Whitmore finally looked up, his gaze moving over Margaret with obvious distaste. He took in her wrinkled clothing, her unkempt appearance, the nervous way she clutched her plastic bag of belongings. "Ms. Holloway," he said, his voice clipped and cold, "do you have legal representation?" "No, Your Honor," Margaret said quietly. "I can't afford a lawyer." "Of course you can't," Whitmore said, and there was something in his tone, a casual contempt that made Margaret's stomach tighten. "Let me guess. You're homeless?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And you broke into this building to sleep?" "The side door was unlocked, Your Honor. I didn't break anything. I was just trying to get out of the cold." Whitmore leaned back in his chair, a thin smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Trying to get out of the cold? How noble!" He glanced at the prosecutor. "Mr. Morrison, enlighten me. How many shelters are there in Chicago?" Morrison looked uncomfortable, but answered, "I believe there are approximately 15 emergency shelters that serve individuals in the downtown area, Your Honor." 15 shelters, Whitmore repeated, looking back at Margaret. "But rather than going to one of those facilities that exist specifically to help people like you decided to break into private property. Do you know what we call that, Ms. Holloway? We call that theft. Your Honor, I didn't take anything. You took shelter that wasn't yours to take, Whitmore interrupted. You trespassed on property that belongs to someone else, property that they own and pay taxes on. And now, because of your poor choices, the property owner has to spend time and money dealing with this situation, and the court has to waste its resources processing your case. Margaret felt her face burning. In the gallery, several people were watching with expressions ranging from sympathy to indifference. Victoria Catherine Ashford, however, had sat up straighter, her attention now completely focused on the exchange. Your Honor, Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady, I understand I made a mistake. I'm willing to pay whatever fine. Whitmore laughed, an actual laugh that echoed through the courtroom. Pay a fine? With what? You just told me you can't even afford a lawyer. You don't have a home. You're carrying your worldly possessions in a grocery bag. He shook his head, his expression morphing from amusement to something harder. Let me tell you what I see, Ms. Holloway. I see someone who has given up, someone who has decided it's easier to live off society's charity than to take responsibility for themselves. That's not true, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. No? Whitmore leaned forward. Then explain to me how a woman your age ends up sleeping in abandoned buildings. What choices did you make that led you here? Because I can tell you, everyone in this country has opportunities if they're willing to work hard enough. People your age, your generation, you had it better than any generation in history. Good jobs, affordable housing, pensions. So, what happened? Did you spend all your money? Make poor investments? Develop a drug problem? Each question felt like a slap. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, to explain about Thomas's illness, the medical bills, the slow cascade of losses that had brought her to this moment. But the words caught in her throat, and she found herself unable to speak. In the gallery, Victoria Catherine Ashford's hands had curled into fists. A memory had surfaced, something she hadn't thought about in years, but now burst into her consciousness with perfect clarity. It had been 23 years ago. Victoria had been 32 years old, a newly appointed federal prosecutor working impossible hours and trying to prove herself in a male-dominated field. She had been pregnant with her first child, her son Alexander, and the pregnancy had been difficult from the start. At 37 weeks, she had gone into premature labor. The complications had been severe. Alexander's heart rate had dropped dangerously low, and the attending physician was in another emergency. Victoria remembered the terror, the certainty that she was going to lose her baby, the desperate prayers to a God she wasn't sure she believed in. And then a nurse had appeared. Not the youngest nurse or the most senior, but a woman with kind blue eyes and sure hands who had assessed the situation, made critical decisions, and stayed with Victoria through the entire ordeal. That nurse had monitored Alexander's heart rate minute by minute, adjusted medications, repositioned Victoria repeatedly to find the optimal angle, and when the physician finally arrived, had provided a calm, competent briefing that allowed the doctor to deliver the baby safely. Victoria had been so grateful, so overwhelmed with relief when Alexander was placed in her arms, healthy and crying lustily. She had asked the nurse her name. Margaret Holloway, the nurse had said with a warm smile. But you can call me Maggie. And congratulations, he's beautiful. Victoria had tried to thank her properly, had even written a letter to the hospital administration praising Margaret's care. But in the years that followed, as her career had taken off and her life had become increasingly busy and complicated, the memory had faded into the background of 1,000 other memories. Now, sitting in this courtroom, watching this woman being humiliated by a judge who clearly saw her as nothing more than a nuisance, Victoria realized with a jolt of recognition that she was looking at the same nurse who had saved her son's life. Margaret Ann Holloway, Maggie. On the bench, Judge Whitmore was still speaking. The city of Chicago has a significant problem with homeless individuals treating private and public property as their personal campground. Every abandoned building, every alley, every park bench becomes a potential shelter, and property owners are left to deal with the mess. It's unsanitary, it's unsafe, and frankly, Ms. Holloway, it's unacceptable. He paused, making a show of considering. I could sentence you to jail time. 30 days would send a clear message that this behavior won't be tolerated. However, our jails are overcrowded enough without adding senior citizens who can't manage their own lives. He said the words senior citizens with particular disdain, as if age were itself a character flaw. Instead, I'm going to fine you $500 and sentence you to 3 days of time served, which you've already completed in holding. If you can't pay the fine within 30 days, a warrant will be issued for your arrest. Do you understand? Margaret nodded mutely. $500. It might as well have been 5 million. Furthermore, Whitmore continued, clearly enjoying himself now, I'm going to take this opportunity to give you some free advice, Ms. Holloway. This country offers opportunities to everyone. There are programs, shelters, job placement services. The fact that you're standing before me today suggests that you haven't taken advantage of these resources. Maybe it's time to stop making excuses and start making better choices. Take some personal responsibility for once in your life. The courtroom was silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her fingers hovering over the keys as if uncertain whether to record such a speech. Victoria Catherine Ashford stood up. The movement drew every eye in the courtroom. Victoria was a striking woman, tall with dark hair swept back from a face that managed to be both elegant and commanding. She wore her authority like a well-tailored suit, comfortable and unmistakable. Your Honor, she said, her voice clear and firm. May I approach the bench? Judge Whitmore's expression shifted from surprise to irritation. I'm sorry, who are you? My name is Victoria Catherine Ashford. She began walking forward, her heels clicking purposefully on the marble floor. I'm CEO of Ashford Development Group, and I'd like to speak on behalf of the defendant. The prosecutor, Daniel Morrison, looked confused. The bailiff took a half-step forward, unsure whether to intervene. Margaret turned to see who was speaking, her eyes widening as she took in the elegant woman approaching the bench. Ms. Ashford, Whitmore said, his tone sharp with warning, this is highly irregular. If you're not representing the defendant in an official capacity, I'm not an attorney, Your Honor, though I do have a law degree from Harvard and spent 8 years as a federal prosecutor before moving into the private sector. Victoria stopped a few feet from where Margaret stood. But I don't need to be representing Ms. Holloway officially to inform this court that it's about to make a grave error in judgment. The judge's face reddened. Excuse me? You've spent the last 10 minutes lecturing this woman about personal responsibility and poor choices, Victoria said, her voice remaining calm but taking on an edge like polished steel. You've made assumptions about her character, her history, and her circumstances without bothering to learn a single relevant fact about who she is or how she came to be in your courtroom. I don't need to know her life story to know that she broke the law. Whitmore shot back. Perhaps not, but you should need to know it before you presume to pass judgment on her worth as a human being. Victoria turned to Margaret, and her expression softened. Ms. Holloway, do you recognize me? Margaret stared at her, trying to place the face. There was something familiar about the woman's eyes, but after 23 years and the fog of exhaustion and stress, she couldn't make the connection. No, ma'am, Margaret said quietly. I'm sorry, I don't. 23 years ago, I went into premature labor with my first child at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. It was a difficult delivery with serious complications. The attending physician was dealing with another emergency, and there was a very real possibility that I was going to lose my baby. Victoria's voice remained steady, but emotion flickered across her face. A nurse stayed with me through the entire ordeal. She made critical decisions that kept my son alive until the doctor could arrive. That nurse's name was Margaret Holloway. The courtroom had gone absolutely silent. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth as the memory came flooding back. A young woman in a business suit being rushed into the delivery ward, the terror in her eyes, the baby's heart rate dropping on the monitor. Margaret remembered it all, the methodical calm she had forced herself to maintain while her own heart raced, the split-second decisions about medications and positioning, the profound relief when the baby had finally been born, crying and pink and alive. "Oh my God," Margaret whispered. "I remember, you had a little boy. Alexander, you named him Alexander." Victoria smiled. "I did. He's 23 now, a graduate student at MIT studying biomedical engineering. He exists because of you, Ms. Holloway, because of your skill, your compassion, and your dedication." Judge Whitmore looked like he had been struck. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. That's a very touching story, Ms. Ashford. But it doesn't change the fact that it changes everything," Victoria interrupted, her voice hardening again as she turned back to face him. "You stood up there on your bench and lectured this woman about making poor choices. You mocked her poverty, suggested she was lazy or irresponsible, implied that she had somehow failed to take advantage of the opportunities this country offers." She took a step closer to the bench, and her presence seemed to fill the courtroom. "Do you want to know what poor choices Ms. Holloway actually made, Your Honor?" She didn't wait for an answer. She chose to spend 43 years working as a registered nurse, caring for people at their most vulnerable. She chose to stay with her husband when he was diagnosed with terminal cancer, caring for him at home rather than placing him in a facility, depleting her life savings to pay for treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. She chose to protect her daughter from worry by not revealing the extent of her financial troubles. Those were her choices, and yes, she chose to seek shelter in an abandoned building rather than freeze to death on the street in 5-degree weather. If you want to call that a poor choice, Your Honor, I invite you to spend one night sleeping outside in January and then tell me what you would have done differently. The judge's face had gone from red to pale. "Ms. Ashford, I appreciate your advocacy, but the law is clear. She trespassed on private property." "She did," Victoria agreed, "and I'm not arguing that she shouldn't face appropriate consequences for that. But what I heard over the past 10 minutes wasn't the application of law. It was the expression of personal prejudice. You looked at a homeless woman and saw someone who didn't deserve basic dignity or respect. You made her poverty into evidence of moral failure." "That's not, I wasn't," Whitmore sputtered. "Your Honor, I've practiced law in this city for over 2 decades, Victoria continued. "I've appeared before dozens of judges, and I've seen how the system treats people differently based on their appearance, their socio-economic status, their ability to afford good legal representation. I've seen wealthy defendants who committed serious white-collar crimes walk away with slaps on the wrist, while poor defendants who stole food or sought shelter received lectures about personal responsibility." She paused, letting her words sink in. "What I witnessed here today was particularly egregious, and frankly, Your Honor, it's beneath the dignity of this court." The prosecutor stood up. "Your Honor, perhaps we could take a brief recess to—" "Sit down, Mr. Morrison," Whitmore said sharply. He was staring at Victoria with an expression that mixed anger, embarrassment, and something that might have been fear. "Ms. Ashford, you've made your point." "Have I?" Victoria pulled her phone from her purse. "Because I recorded the last 8 minutes of these proceedings on my phone. Would you like me to send the audio to the Judicial Inquiry Board? or perhaps to the Chicago Tribune. I'm sure they'd be very interested in hearing how you speak to defendants who appear before you without counsel." "That's a threat," Whitmore said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's a promise," Victoria corrected. "This woman saved my son's life. She dedicated her entire career to helping people, and when she fell on hard times through no fault of her own, the system failed her. And then you, from your position of power and privilege, decided to compound that failure by humiliating her in your courtroom." She slipped her phone back into her purse. "So yes, Your Honor, I'm prepared to make an issue of this." The silence that followed was heavy and tense. Finally, Judge Whitmore cleared his throat. "Ms. Holloway," he said, and his tone was noticeably different now, not warm, but at least no longer contemptuous. "I'm going to vacate the fine. You're free to go with time served." "That's not good enough," Victoria said. Whitmore's jaw tightened. "What else do you want?" "An apology would be a good start." The judge looked like he had just been asked to swallow broken glass. The courtroom waited, the tension so thick it was almost visible. Finally, Whitmore looked directly at Margaret. "Ms. Holloway, I apologize for my comments. They were inappropriate and did not reflect the respect that should be afforded to everyone who appears in this court." The words were stiff and clearly forced, but they were said. Margaret nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. "Thank you, Your Honor," Victoria said crisply. She turned to Margaret and gently took her arm. "Come on, let's get you out of here." As they walked toward the courtroom doors, Margaret felt as though she were moving through a dream. The other people in the gallery watched them pass with expressions of shock and fascination. The bailiff held the door open, and then they were in the hallway, and Margaret's legs suddenly felt too weak to hold her. Victoria guided her to a bench along the wall. "Sit down. Take a breath." Margaret sat, her hands shaking violently now that the adrenaline was beginning to fade. I can't believe... Who are you? I mean, I remember the birth, but after you saved Alexander, I went on to have a very successful career as a prosecutor, and eventually I moved into real estate development. My company, Ashford Development Group, handles major commercial and residential projects throughout the Midwest. Victoria sat down beside her. "I've been very fortunate, Ms. Holloway. My son is healthy and thriving. I have a successful business, and I've had opportunities that many people never get. But I've never forgotten that none of it would have been possible without you." Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "I was just doing my job." "You saved my son's life," Victoria said firmly. "That's considerably more than just a job." She was quiet for a moment, studying Margaret's exhausted face. "Tell me what happened. How did you end up homeless?" And so Margaret told her about Thomas's diagnosis and the long months of his illness, about the medical bills that had multiplied like weeds, choking out their financial stability, about losing the house, the apartment, the job, about the slow descent into a life she had never imagined possible, where every day was consumed with the basic struggle to survive. Victoria listened without interrupting, her expression growing more troubled with each detail. When Margaret finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "This shouldn't have happened," Victoria finally said. "No one should lose everything because they got sick. No one should end up on the streets after a lifetime of service." She stood up decisively. "Come with me." "Where?" "First, to get your belongings from property. Then, to get you a hot meal. And then, we're going to figure out how to fix this situation." Margaret looked up at her, afraid to hope. "Why are you doing this?" Victoria smiled, and for a moment Margaret could see the frightened young woman she had been 23 years ago in the delivery room. "Because you saved my son when I couldn't. Because you dedicated your life to helping people. And because everyone deserves a second chance, Ms. Holloway." She held out her hand. "Let me help you." Margaret took her hand and stood, feeling something she hadn't felt in months. A tiny flicker of hope lighting up in the darkness that had consumed her life. As they walked down the courthouse corridor together, neither of them noticed Judge Richard Whitmore standing in the doorway of his courtroom, watching them leave with an expression of profound unease. He had been a judge for 17 years, and in that time he had ruled on thousands of cases, but he had never, not once, been challenged the way Victoria Catherine Ashford had challenged him today. And deep down, in a place he rarely examined, he knew she had been right. 3 days after the courtroom confrontation, Margaret sat in a comfortable chair in the lobby of the Palmer House Hotel, waiting for Victoria to finish a business call. She was wearing new clothes, nothing fancy, just a pair of dark slacks, a soft blue sweater, and a warm winter coat that actually fit properly. Victoria had taken her shopping the day after the court hearing, brushing aside Margaret's protests about accepting charity. "It's not charity," Victoria had said firmly. "It's gratitude. There's a difference." The past 72 hours had felt like living in an alternate reality. Victoria had checked Margaret into a modest but clean hotel near Lincoln Park, making it clear that Margaret could stay as long as necessary. She had taken Margaret to dinner that first night at a quiet Italian restaurant where they had talked for hours about their lives, their families, their losses and triumphs. Margaret had learned that Victoria's son Alexander was indeed studying biomedical engineering, working on prosthetic limb technology that could be controlled by neural signals. Victoria's daughter, Isabella Grace Ashford, was 19 and in her sophomore year at Northwestern, studying social work because she wanted to help vulnerable populations. Victoria had been divorced for 6 years from a hedge fund manager who had turned out to be more interested in his secretary than in his marriage. "Apparently, I was too focused on my career," Victoria had said with a wry smile. "He wasn't entirely wrong, though it didn't excuse the affair. But the divorce was as amicable as these things can be, and my relationship with my children is solid, so I suppose it worked out." In turn, Margaret had told Victoria about Emily, about the 2 grandsons she had only seen twice, about the guilt she felt at lying to her daughter about her circumstances. Victoria had listened with the same focused attention she had displayed in the courtroom, occasionally asking questions, never judging. On the second day, Victoria had arranged for Margaret to see a doctor. Dr. Sarah Jean Brennan was a primary care physician in her 40s who ran a practice in Lakeview and donated several hours each week to treating homeless individuals through a local charity. She had examined Margaret thoroughly, noting the malnutrition, the untreated arthritis, the early signs of pneumonia that could have become serious if left untreated. "You need rest, proper nutrition and medication for that arthritis," Dr. Brennan had said, writing prescriptions. "The pneumonia isn't severe yet, but we're going to treat it aggressively with antibiotics. And Ms. Holloway, you're lucky to be alive. Another few weeks living on the streets in these conditions, and we'd be having a very different conversation." Margaret had nodded, accepting the prescriptions with shaking hands and profound gratitude. Now, sitting in the elegant hotel lobby, watching well-dressed people move through their privileged lives, Margaret felt disconnected from everything. Part of her kept waiting to wake up back in that abandoned building to discover that all of this, Victoria's intervention, the doctor's care, the warm hotel room and new clothes, had been nothing more than a desperate dream. Victoria finished her call and walked over, slipping her phone into her purse. "Sorry about that. Dealing with a contractor who thinks building codes are more suggestions than requirements." She sat down across from Margaret. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Margaret said honestly. The antibiotics were working, and 3 nights of real sleep in a warm bed had made an enormous difference. "I can't thank you enough for everything you've done." "We're not done yet," Victoria said. "I've been making some calls, doing some research. I want to talk to you about next steps." Margaret felt a flutter of anxiety. She had been avoiding thinking about the future. living instead in the temporary bubble of safety that Victoria had created. But bubbles always burst eventually. "What kind of next steps?" she asked. Victoria pulled a folder from her leather briefcase. "First, I've been in touch with an attorney who specializes in bankruptcy law. Your situation with the medical debt and the foreclosure, there are legal remedies that could have helped you if you'd had access to proper counsel. It's too late to save the house, but we can address the outstanding debts and help you rebuild your credit." She pulled out another document. "Second, I've contacted several nursing homes and assisted living facilities that my company has relationships with. Many of them are looking for experienced nurses to work part-time, particularly for consultation on care plans and staff training. Your arthritis might make hands-on patient care difficult, but your knowledge and experience are valuable. I have 3 interviews set up for next week, if you're interested." Margaret stared at the papers in disbelief. "You've done all this in 3 days." "I have very good staff," Victoria said with a slight smile, "but there's more. I've also been in touch with a housing coordinator at a non-profit called Home at Last. They help place previously homeless individuals in affordable housing and provide support services to help them maintain stable living situations. They have an opening in a subsidized senior housing complex in Rogers Park. 1 bedroom, all utilities included, rent based on your income. It's available immediately if you want it." The papers in Victoria's hands blurred as Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I don't understand. Why would you do all this for me?" Victoria set the folder aside and leaned forward. 23 years ago, you stayed with me for 7 hours during the most frightening experience of my life. You held my hand. You told me my baby was going to be okay, even when you weren't sure that was true. You made me feel safe when I was terrified." Her voice grew husky with emotion. "You didn't know who I was or whether I could ever repay you. You just did your job with compassion and skill because that's who you are. Now I'm in a position to help you, and I'm going to do it because that's who I want to be." Margaret wiped at her tears with the back of her hand. "I spent my whole career taking care of people, and then, when I needed help myself, I was too proud to ask for it. I didn't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden," Victoria said firmly. "You're a human being who fell on hard times through no fault of your own. The system failed you, Ms. Holloway. Multiple systems failed you. Healthcare, housing, social services. You did everything right for your entire life, and you still ended up sleeping in an abandoned building." She picked up the folder again. "So, we're going to change that. Not just for you, but for everyone who falls through these cracks." "What do you mean?" Victoria's expression took on a determined quality that Margaret was beginning to recognize. "That situation in Judge Whitmore's courtroom, what I witnessed isn't unique. I've been doing research over the past few days, looking into his case history. There's a pattern of dismissive treatment toward low-income defendants, particularly those who are homeless or appear before him without counsel. Higher fines, harsher sentences, and a level of personal contempt that has no place in a courtroom." She pulled out another set of documents. "I filed a formal complaint with the Illinois Judicial Inquiry Board. I've also reached out to several legal advocacy organizations that work on behalf of homeless individuals. We're putting together a comprehensive report on systemic bias in the Cook County court system." Margaret felt a chill of worry. "Will that cause trouble for you?" "Possibly," Victoria admitted. "Judge Whitmore has connections, and he's not going to take this challenge lightly, but I have connections too. And more importantly, I have the resources to push back. My company has standing in this community, and I'm not afraid to use that standing to shine a light on injustice." She paused, studying Margaret's face. "I need to ask you something, though. If this moves forward, if there's an investigation, or if the media picks up the story, you'll likely be identified as the homeless woman in that courtroom. Your story will become public. I can try to minimize that, but I can't guarantee your privacy will be protected. I need to know if you're okay with that. Margaret thought about her daughter Emily, about her grandsons who didn't know their grandmother had been living on the streets. She thought about her former colleagues at the hospital, about the neighbors from her old life who would learn how far she had fallen. But she also thought about Dorothy Schultz, Dot, who had sat with her in the holding cell and warned her about Judge Whitmore. She thought about the dozens of other homeless individuals she had encountered over the past month, each with their own story of loss and survival. She thought about how the judge had looked at her with such contempt, as if her poverty made her less human. "I'm okay with it," Margaret said quietly. "If telling my story can help other people, then it needs to be told." Victoria smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." She gathered up the papers and returned them to her briefcase. "Now, there's one more thing I want to discuss with you, and this one is entirely personal rather than professional." "What is it?" "I think you should call your daughter." Margaret's immediate instinct was to refuse, to keep protecting Emily from the truth. But Victoria continued before she could speak. "I understand why you didn't tell her what was happening. You were trying to spare her worry, trying not to be a burden. But Ms. Holloway, she's your daughter. She loves you. And if she found out that you went through all of this alone, that you were homeless and sick and facing criminal charges without reaching out to her, it would break her heart." Victoria's expression softened. "Give her the chance to be there for you. Give her the chance to show you the same love and care that you showed her all her life." Margaret thought about Emily's voice on the phone during their last conversation 3 weeks ago. Emily had been stressed about work, worried about her younger son who was struggling with reading. Margaret had listened and offered advice, never mentioning that she was calling from a public library because she had nowhere else to go. "What if she's angry that I didn't tell her sooner?" Margaret asked. "Then she'll be angry. That's part of being family, working through the difficult emotions together." Victoria stood up. "I'll leave you to think about it. But in the meantime, why don't we go get some lunch? There's a wonderful cafe a few blocks from here that makes the best French onion soup you've ever tasted." As they left the hotel together and stepped out into the cold January air, Margaret realized that something fundamental had shifted inside her. For the first time in months, she felt like a person again, rather than just a problem to be solved or a nuisance to be removed. She felt seen, valued, and worthy of help. That evening, back in her hotel room with a full stomach and Victoria's words echoing in her mind, Margaret picked up the phone Victoria had given her. A simple prepaid device, nothing fancy, but it worked. She stared at it for a long time, gathering her courage. Finally, she dialed Emily's number. The phone rang 3 times before her daughter's voice came through. "Hello? Emily, sweetheart, it's Mom." "Mom, hi. I was just thinking about calling you. How are you doing?" Margaret took a deep breath. "Emily, I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen until I'm finished, okay?" There was a pause, and when Emily spoke again, her voice was cautious. "Okay, I'm listening." And so, for the second time in 3 days, Margaret told her story. She told Emily about the medical bills and losing the house. She told her about the months of struggling and the descent into homelessness. She told her about sleeping in an abandoned building and being arrested and standing in that courtroom while a judge made her feel worthless. She also told Emily about Victoria, about the miraculous intervention and the help she was receiving. She explained that she was safe now, that she had a path forward, but that she had needed to be honest about what had happened. When she finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Margaret heard soft crying, and her heart broke. "Emily, I'm so sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I didn't want to worry you, didn't want to be a burden." "Mom," Emily's voice was thick with tears but also firm. "Mom, stop. You are not and will never be a burden. You're my mother. I love you, and I'm furious that you went through all of that alone, but I'm also so grateful that this woman, Victoria, found you when she did." She took a shaky breath. "I'm booking a flight. I'll be there tomorrow." "Emily, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. The boys can stay with my friend Rachel for a few days. I'm coming to Chicago, and I'm going to help you figure this out." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in a very long time, they were tears of relief rather than despair. "Thank you, sweetheart. Thank you for finally telling me," Emily said. "I'll text you my flight information as soon as I have it. I love you, Mom." "I love you too." After they hung up, Margaret sat on the edge of the hotel bed, phone still clutched in her hand. Through the window, she could see the Chicago skyline lit up against the night sky. The same city where she had spent most of her life, where she had worked and loved and raised a family, where she had nearly died in the cold. But now, for the first time in a very long time, that city felt like it might become home again. 4 months later, Margaret stood at the window of her apartment in Rogers Park, watching the April rain fall softly on the greening trees below. The apartment was small but comfortable. A one-bedroom unit with a decent kitchen, a living room just large enough for a couch and a small table, and a bathroom that actually had hot water that lasted more than 5 minutes. The furniture was mostly second-hand, but it was hers, and that made all the difference. On the refrigerator, held up by a magnet shaped like the Space Needle, was a photograph that Emily had sent. It showed Margaret with her 2 grandsons during Emily's visit to Chicago in January. The boys, aged 7 and 9, grinned at the camera, each holding one of their grandmother's hands. Emily had spent 4 days in Chicago, helping Margaret navigate the paperwork for the housing program, attending one of the job interviews with her, and simply being present. "I can't believe you thought you'd be a burden," Emily had said on her last day before flying back to Seattle. "Mom, you spent your whole life taking care of other people. Let us take care of you for once." The job interview had turned out well. Margaret now worked 15 hours a week at Evergreen Senior Living, a high-end assisted care facility in Evanston. She didn't provide direct patient care. Her arthritis made that impractical, but she consulted on care plans, trained new staff members, and served as a patient advocate, making sure residents' concerns were heard and addressed. The pay was modest, but enough to cover her subsidized rent and living expenses, with a little left over to start rebuilding her savings. More than the money, though, the work had given her back a sense of purpose. She was using her knowledge and experience to help people again, and that made her feel like herself for the first time since Thomas's death. On the small table by the window sat her laptop, another gift from Victoria, who had insisted that Margaret needed to be able to email her grandchildren and video chat with Emily. Margaret was slowly getting the hang of technology, though the learning curve was steep for someone who had spent most of her nursing career writing notes by hand. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Victoria standing in the hallway, looking elegant as always in a navy suit, but with her hair slightly windblown from the rain. "I hope this isn't a bad time," Victoria said. "I was in the neighborhood for a site inspection and thought I'd stop by." "Of course not. Come in." Margaret stepped aside, suddenly self-conscious about her modest apartment. Victoria had been here once before, right after Margaret moved in, but it still felt strange to entertain someone of Victoria's stature in such humble surroundings. If Victoria noticed or cared about the apartment's simplicity, she didn't show it. She accepted the offer of tea and settled onto the couch while Margaret prepared 2 cups in the kitchen. "How's the job going?" Victoria asked. "Really well," Margaret said, bringing out the tea. "We had a staff training session yesterday on recognizing signs of elder abuse and neglect. It's heartbreaking how common it is, but I'm glad I can help train people to watch for it." "You're doing important work," Victoria said. She took a sip of tea, then set down her cup. I wanted to update you on the situation with Judge Whitmore. Margaret felt a flutter of anxiety. The past 4 months had seen significant developments on that front, not all of them pleasant. After Victoria had filed her complaint with the Judicial Inquiry Board, the story had indeed become public. A reporter from the Chicago Tribune had picked it up, running a front-page article titled, "Homeless Nurse Humiliated in Court, but CEO Remembers Her Compassion." The article had detailed Margaret's situation, Victoria's intervention, and the larger questions about how the courts treated homeless defendants. The response had been intense and immediate. On social media, the story had gone viral, with thousands of people sharing it and commenting on everything from the healthcare system's failures to judicial bias. Several legal advocacy groups had reached out to Margaret, asking permission to use her case as an example in their work on behalf of homeless individuals. Judge Whitmore had responded with a terse statement claiming that his comments had been taken out of context and that he had the utmost respect for all defendants who appear before him. But the damage was done. Other defendants began coming forward with their own stories of dismissive treatment in his courtroom, and the Judicial Inquiry Board had opened a formal investigation. The Inquiry Board completed their investigation last week, Victoria said now. They found evidence of a pattern of behavior inconsistent with the Judicial Code of Conduct, particularly regarding treatment of low-income and homeless defendants. "What does that mean?" Margaret asked. "It means Judge Whitmore has been officially censured. It's a public reprimand that will be part of his permanent record. They've also mandated that he complete training on implicit bias and judicial ethics." Victoria paused. Additionally, several legal organizations have announced they'll be monitoring his courtroom going forward to ensure the behavior doesn't continue. Margaret absorbed this information. Part of her felt vindicated. The man who had humiliated her was facing consequences. But another part felt oddly sad. She had never set out to ruin anyone's career. She had just been trying to survive. "How does he feel about all this?" she asked. Victoria's expression was unreadable. "That's actually the other thing I wanted to tell you. He asked if I would arrange a meeting with you." Margaret's eyebrows shot up. "What? Why?" "He says he wants to apologize, in person, not in a courtroom under duress." Victoria studied Margaret's face. "I told him I would ask you, but that you were under no obligation to agree. You don't owe him anything, Ms. Holloway." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, thinking. She remembered the contempt in Judge Whitmore's eyes, the casual cruelty of his words, the way he had made her feel worthless. Did she want to see him again, to give him the opportunity to salve his conscience? But she also remembered being a nurse, sitting with patients who had made terrible mistakes and were living with the consequences. She remembered the healing power of forgiveness, both for the forgiven and the forgiver. "I'll meet with him," she said finally, "but on my terms. Here in my apartment, not in his courtroom or chambers, and I want you there." Victoria nodded. "I'll arrange it." The meeting took place 1 week later on a Saturday afternoon. Margaret had spent the morning cleaning her already clean apartment and trying not to be nervous. Emily had called that morning to offer support. "You don't have to do this, Mom," Emily had said. "You don't owe this guy anything." "I know," Margaret had replied, "but I think I need to. For myself, if not for him." When the knock came at 2 o'clock, Margaret took a deep breath and opened the door. Victoria stood there, and behind her was Judge Richard Whitmore. He looked different out of his judicial robes, smaller somehow and older. He wore khaki pants and a button-down shirt, and his face was drawn with what looked like genuine distress. When he met Margaret's eyes, he immediately looked away. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he said quietly. Margaret stepped aside to let them in. Victoria took her usual spot on the couch, and Whitmore sat in the armchair, perched on the edge, as if ready to flee at any moment. Margaret sat in her chair by the window, the afternoon light behind her. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, Whitmore cleared his throat. "Miss Holloway, I owe you an apology, a real one, not the performative statement I made in the courtroom." He looked down at his hands. "What I said to you that day was inexcusable. I was cruel, dismissive, and completely wrong. I made assumptions about you based on your appearance and circumstances, and I treated you as less than human. I'm deeply sorry." Margaret watched him carefully, trying to gauge his sincerity. "Why did you do it?" she asked. Whitmore flinched. That's a complicated question." "I'm not in a hurry," Margaret said evenly. He was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with how to answer. "When I first became a judge," he finally said, "I had all these ideals about justice and fairness, but after years of seeing the same people come through my courtroom again and again, drug addicts, repeat offenders, people who seemed to make the worst possible choices, I became hardened, cynical. I started to see poverty not as a circumstance, but as a character flaw." He looked up at Margaret, and there was genuine pain in his eyes. "I forgot that everyone who appears before me is a human being with a story I don't know. I forgot that my job isn't to judge people's worth, but to fairly apply the law. And when you stood in my courtroom that day, I saw you through that cynical lens and treated you accordingly." "You humiliated me," Margaret said quietly. "You made me feel worthless at a time when I was already at my lowest point." "I know, and I'm sorry." Whitmore's voice broke slightly. "Ms. Ashford's complaint and the investigation that followed, it forced me to look at my own behavior, to review transcripts of my hearings and really see how I was treating people. It was horrifying. I had become the kind of judge I used to despise when I was a young lawyer." Victoria spoke up. "Judge Whitmore has also taken steps beyond what the inquiry board mandated. He's completed additional training on trauma-informed jurisprudence and has begun working with a legal aid organization to better understand the challenges faced by low-income defendants." "I'm not telling you this to excuse my behavior," Whitmore added quickly. "There is no excuse. I'm telling you because I want you to know that I've taken your experience seriously, and I'm working to make sure I never treat another person the way I treated you." Margaret studied him for a long moment. She could see the shame and regret in his face, hear the genuine remorse in his voice. She thought about the years she had spent as a nurse, watching people struggle with their mistakes and their guilt, helping them find paths toward healing. "Do you remember asking me how a woman my age ended up sleeping in abandoned buildings?" she asked. Whitmore nodded, looking pained. "You asked what choices I had made, as if poverty was something I had chosen." Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Judge Whitmore, I worked for 43 years. I was a good nurse, I paid my taxes, saved money, did everything society says you're supposed to do. And then my husband got sick, and despite having insurance, the medical bills destroyed us financially. I lost everything because the person I loved most in the world got cancer." She paused, letting that sink in. "I didn't end up homeless because I made poor choices. I ended up homeless because our systems, healthcare, housing, social services, are fundamentally broken. They fail people every day, people who did everything right, but still fell through the cracks." "I understand that now," Whitmore said quietly. "And I'm sorry I didn't understand it before." Margaret was quiet for a moment, then surprised herself by saying, "I forgive you." Whitmore looked up sharply, his eyes widening. "You... what?" "I forgive you," Margaret repeated. "What you did was wrong, and it hurt me deeply. But I've spent my whole life believing in second chances and in people's capacity to change. If you're genuinely trying to do better, to treat people with more compassion and understanding, then I can forgive you." Whitmore's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," he whispered. "You're far more gracious than I deserve. Maybe Margaret said with a slight smile. But grace isn't about what people deserve. It's about choosing compassion even when it's not required. They talked for another hour after that. A strange, unlikely conversation between three people brought together by circumstance and tragedy. Judge Whitmore shared stories about cases that had haunted him over the years, defendants whose faces he still remembered, moments when he knew he had failed to see the human being behind the charges. Victoria talked about her work with Ashford Development Group and how she was beginning to redirect some of her company's resources toward affordable housing initiatives. Margaret found herself talking about nursing, about the privilege of being present during people's most vulnerable moments, births, deaths, and everything in between. She talked about the satisfaction of easing someone's pain, of holding a frightened patient's hand, of explaining complex medical information in terms that made sense to worried families. "I miss it," she admitted. "Not the physical demands, my hands can't do that work anymore, but the connection with people, the feeling that I was making a difference." "You're still making a difference," Victoria said. "The work you're doing at Evergreen is incredibly valuable. And more than that, your story is inspiring change throughout the city's court system." It was true. In the 4 months since Margaret's case had become public, several reforms had been implemented in Cook County courts. A new protocol required judges to ask unrepresented defendants if they understood their right to counsel and to provide information about legal aid services. Court staff had been trained to recognize signs of homelessness, mental illness, and trauma, and to connect defendants with appropriate resources. Several advocacy groups were now regularly monitoring courtrooms to document how judges treated vulnerable defendants. When Judge Whitmore finally stood to leave, he paused at the door. "Ms. Holloway, I want you to know that I'll be retiring at the end of this year. The censure isn't forcing me out. It's my choice. I've been a judge for 17 years, and I think it's time for someone with fresh eyes and more compassion to take my place." Margaret nodded. "What will you do?" A small smile crossed his face. "I've been asked to teach a course on judicial ethics at Northwestern Law School, and I'm going to volunteer with a legal aid organization, helping low-income defendants navigate the system. I figure I should use my experience, both the good and the bad, to help people who are facing what you faced." "That sounds like meaningful work," Margaret said sincerely. After he left, Victoria stayed behind for a few more minutes. "How are you really doing?" she asked. Margaret thought about the question. 4 months ago, she had been sleeping on a concrete floor in an abandoned building, convinced that her life was essentially over. Now she had an apartment, a job, a restored relationship with her daughter, and a future that held possibilities instead of just survival. "I'm doing well," she said. "Better than I ever thought I would be again." She paused. "Victoria, I need to thank you properly. You saved my life, not just in that courtroom, but in all the ways you've helped me since. I can never repay that." "You already did," Victoria said softly. 23 years ago, in a hospital room when I was terrified and alone. You don't remember, but you held my hand while we waited for the doctor. You told me stories about other mothers you'd helped, other babies who were born healthy despite complications. You made me believe everything would be okay." Her eyes glistened with emotion. "You gave me my son, Ms. Holloway. Everything I've done for you is just paying forward what you did for me." After Victoria left, Margaret stood at her window again, watching the spring rain fall on the Chicago streets below. The city looked different now, not because it had changed, but because she had. She had been to the very bottom, had felt what it was like to be invisible, disposable, less than human in the eyes of society. And she had climbed back out, not just through her own strength, but through the intervention of someone whose life she had touched decades earlier. Margaret sat in the basement meeting room of Grace Lutheran Church in Rogers Park, surrounded by a circle of folding chairs. Around her sat 11 other people, men and women ranging in age from their 20s to their 70s, all of whom had experienced homelessness. This was a peer support group organized by Home at Last, the non-profit that had helped Margaret find her apartment. Tonight was Margaret's first time as a co-facilitator. She had been attending the group for 2 months as a participant, but the coordinator, an energetic young woman named Jennifer Marie Thompson, had asked if Margaret would be willing to share her story and help lead the discussion. "I know some of you have seen the news stories about what happened to me," Margaret began, feeling nervous despite having spoken to thousands of people during her nursing career. "But tonight, I want to tell you the parts that didn't make the news. The parts about shame and fear and feeling like I had somehow failed as a human being." She talked about the first night she had slept outside, about the terror of not knowing where her next meal would come from, about the way people looked through her as if she didn't exist. She talked about losing not just her home and her possessions, but her sense of identity and purpose. "I was a nurse for 43 years, she said. "I took care of people. I was competent, respected, needed. And then suddenly, I was just another homeless person taking up space, another problem for society to solve." A man named Robert James Sullivan, who appeared to be in his late 50s, nodded vigorously. "That's the worst part," he said. "Not the cold or the hunger. It's the way people treat you like you're not even human anymore." "Exactly," Margaret agreed, "and I internalized that. I started to believe that maybe I was worthless, that maybe I had failed in some fundamental way." "What changed?" asked a younger woman named Crystal Lynn Martinez. "I mean, obviously this CEO lady helped you, but how did you start to feel like a person again?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "It wasn't just one thing. Victoria's intervention gave me a chance to rebuild, practically, a place to live, a job, medical care. But emotionally, what really helped was recognizing that what happened to me wasn't my fault. I didn't fail. The systems failed me. The healthcare system that bankrupted me when my husband got sick. The housing system that didn't have affordable options for someone on a fixed income. The social services system that was so overwhelmed it couldn't catch everyone who was falling." She leaned forward, making eye contact with each person in the circle. "You didn't fail either. Every single one of us in this room ended up homeless because of circumstances largely beyond our control. Maybe it was medical bills, or job loss, or domestic violence, or mental illness, or addiction. But none of those things make you worthless. They make you human." The discussion continued for another hour. People shared their stories, their fears, their small victories. Crystal talked about how she had finally saved enough money to get her driver's license reinstated. Robert shared that he had been offered a job at a warehouse starting next week. A quiet man named Michael Thomas Henderson, who rarely spoke, mentioned that he had called his sister for the first time in 3 years, and she had actually answered. After the meeting ended, Jennifer pulled Margaret aside. "You're really good at this. Have you ever thought about doing it more formally? We're always looking for peer counselors, people with lived experience who can work with individuals transitioning out of homelessness." Margaret felt a surge of interest. "I'd like that. How would it work?" "There's a training program, 40 hours over 4 weeks. Then you'd be matched with people who are new to the program, helping them navigate resources, offering support, basically being someone who understands what they're going through because you've been there." "I'm interested," Margaret said, "very interested." Walking home from the church that evening, Margaret pulled out her phone and called Emily. "Hey, Mom," Emily answered, sounding cheerful. "How was the support group?" "Really good. They asked me to co-facilitate tonight, and I think it went well." Margaret paused at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change, "and they offered me training to become a peer counselor. I'd be working with people who are transitioning out of homelessness. Mom, that's wonderful. Are you going to do it? I think so. It feels right, you know, using what I went through to help other people. That's very you, Emily said warmly. Always taking care of people, even when you're the one who needs care. They talked for a few more minutes, Emily updating her about the boys' latest adventures and sharing that she had been approved for a raise at work. Before they hung up, Emily said, "I'm proud of you, Mum. I know the last year has been hell, but you didn't just survive. You're thriving, and you're going to help other people thrive too." After the call ended, Margaret continued her walk home. The late April evening was beautiful, the air soft and warm, the trees fully leafed out, flowers blooming in window boxes and small front gardens. She passed a bus stop where a woman sat with several bags, clearly homeless, and Margaret stopped. "Excuse me," she said gently, "are you okay? Do you need any help?" The woman looked up, suspicious at first, then softening when she saw Margaret's kind expression. "I'm all right, just waiting." Margaret pulled a card from her purse, one that Jennifer had given her, listing resources for homeless individuals in Chicago. "Here, this has information about shelters, meal programs, and services that can help. And there's a support group that meets every Wednesday at Grace Lutheran, about 6 blocks that way. You'd be welcome." The woman took the card, studied it for a moment, then looked back at Margaret. "Thank you. You're welcome. And I know it probably doesn't feel like it right now, but things can get better, I promise." As Margaret walked the final blocks to her apartment building, she thought about the strange and winding path her life had taken. She had lost so much: her husband, her home, her financial security, her sense of safety in the world. She had been humiliated in a courtroom and treated as less than human. But she had also discovered reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. She had learned that pride could be dangerous when it prevented you from asking for help. She had experienced the profound grace of forgiveness, both given and received. And she had been reminded that one act of kindness, one nurse staying with a frightened mother 23 years ago, could ripple forward through time in ways impossible to predict. She climbed the stairs to her third-floor apartment, unlocked the door, and stepped into the small space that was hers. On her refrigerator, beside the photo of her and her grandsons, was a new edition, a newspaper clipping about the reforms in the Cook County court system. The headline read, "New protocols aim to protect vulnerable defendants." Margaret made herself a cup of tea and sat in her chair by the window, watching the last light fade from the sky. Tomorrow she would go to work at Evergreen, helping train staff on patient-centered care. On Wednesday, she would attend the support group. Next week, she would start the peer counselor training. She had a purpose again. She mattered again. She was, once more, someone who made a difference in the world. And perhaps most importantly, she had learned that even in the darkest moments, even when it seemed like all was lost, there was always the possibility of grace, of an unexpected intervention, a second chance, a new beginning. Margaret sipped her tea and smiled, feeling genuinely at peace for the first time in years. The winter that had nearly killed her was over. Spring had arrived.